This episode of the Better Every Shift podcast is sponsored by The Fire Store. Learn more about getting the gear you need at prices you can afford by visiting thefirestore.com.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Better Every Shift podcast. I am your host, Aaron Zamzow. I'm a fire officer way up north in Wisconsin. And today we're doing a little one-on-one discussion with a friend of mine from, West Coast originally. Now he's on the East Coast representing the fire service, doing some really great work with the USFA, Chief Bob Horton. Before I get into your bio and all the different things that you're doing, how are you and welcome?
Well, I'm great, Zam. Thank you very much for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to spending some time visiting with you and the listeners.
Well, I am a structural firefighter, but we don't get a lot of wildfires in my area, yet. But we're gonna address that. And you were just appointed a little while ago. How long have you been in this position as wildfire policy or chief for wildfire policy?
I'm going on my eighth week.
Your eighth week, so you are you're 2 months into this. This is great because
Yes.
right. And you were just appointed to that by Dr. Lori Mormero. You're going to provide leadership guidance to the wildfire and policy branch within the executive services with USFA. You're also a senior advisor to the USFA and other government agencies on the legislative branch or the legislative side on issues pertaining to wildfire and policy. And then you were serving as the senior director for research and policy of the Western Fire Chiefs, correct? Right before this?
That's correct. Yeah.
And you were also a fire chief for 8 years, I believe, right? You said?
About 5.5.
Five and a half
years
Okay.
I was the chief. Yeah.
Okay. And you're new to this new position. And so the first thing I got to ask you, how's it going so far? Do you feel like you're swimming, sinking, or in between bobbing?
Yeah, maybe bobbing's the best example of that. I want to start in with something though that you said, Zam, that you're a structural firefighter, and so am I, and so was I, right? And that's where I cut my teeth in the fire service in Las Vegas, Nevada. I was born and raised there. I grew up in Las Vegas Fire and Rescue, the city department, for those that know that area, and could talk more about like my history because it's going to be relevant on how I ended up where I'm at today, except for the wildfire part, because I have an unconventional path to learning and understanding wildfire and to get to that place where we're doing policy work in Washington, D.C. around that. But I grew up there. I joined the administration in Las Vegas, started as the EMS chief, and then navigated in as the operational support chief. That was all the areas of responsibility that were not fire operations, not the battalion chiefs. And I did that until it was time to leave Las Vegas. And my parents had retired from Las Vegas and moved to the Pacific Northwest. My brother, a few years later, moved out to the Pacific Northwest, met his wife there. So all my family had moved out there, and it was time to leave Vegas. I was looking for opportunities in the Northwest and found myself a really gem of a community to work in, where they hired me as their fire chief in Southern Oregon, which also turned out to be at extreme risk for wildfire.
Mm-hmm, right.
So I was on this, this interview board sitting across from me, board of directors. It's a fire district governance structure. I got the board of directors sitting across from me, asking me what I know about wildfire, giving them a deer in the headlights look. So don't really know anything about wildfire. Very transparent about that. And they were open. I mean, they weren't looking for a wildfire expert. Frankly, they were looking for somebody with an EMS background. I said, well, that was something I could talk about. Like I did have an extensive background in EMS and program management, so on and so forth. And that's where they were looking to develop. They had a great leadership team for wildfire, and they said, we're confident you can learn, we're comfortable with you, and in you go. And fast forward all these years later, I was just at an event with that board president just a couple of weeks ago, and every time we get together now, we have a laugh. He says, I remember sitting across the table from you. You're telling me you never even seen a wildfire in your life, and now you're at the nation's capital as a policy policy, I use that term loosely, policy expert around wildfire for our government. There's a lot in between we can unpack if those are questions you want to know about how did we
Yeah.
get from here to there. But it's an unconventional path, and it's been pretty exciting journey for me. So,
Well, and
but Bobby, yes.
yeah, Bobby. So, but I think you bring up a great point, right? Why, if I'm structural, why do I even care about what wildfire policy is doing, right? Like, why should I? Like right now, there's probably some structural guys going, I'm not going to listen to this one, and I'm going
Yeah.
to tell them right now, you better, because A, it's coming, and B, you can help, right? Like,
Yeah.
so why should us, as so-called structural guys, listen and take note?
I think there's 3 areas that we need to be paying particular attention to for those folks that you were just framing up in that question. Number
Well, fire
one
service
is,
in general, right? Like, I think
yeah,
everybody needs to hear this. Yeah, for
everyone
sure.
everyone needs to hear this. For one is wildfire is coming to a town near you. Right. You may not have experienced it yet, but it is likely coming to your. I'm just gonna be people on here rolling their eyes like it's never coming here. Probably is, maybe not in your career. But we also have listeners on here who said the same thing. Like, we don't have a wildfire problem. And now all of a sudden they got 5-10 acres that's moving fast. And they found themselves in a position. That's a small fire for those who don't know. That's a
Right.
small
Well,
fire. But
if
10-15 acres is an overwhelming sight to you if
yeah,
you have never seen that. And when it's pushing towards your community and it's threatening to embrace your structures, and you got a nice push with a 30-40 mile an hour wind or more, you've got yourself a major wildfire problem on your hands. And if you haven't been trained tactically on how to navigate that, now's the time.
yeah,
Right. So we've got wildfires coming to a town near you, and we need to start to prepare our thinking around what does that look like? How do we equip ourselves? How do we train ourselves? How do we adjust our tactics to understand when we have a structure fire that we're fighting, or we have a structure to structure conflagration problem on our hands, and we treat those tactically different. Number 2, we have major wildfires all throughout the United States. Our structural firefighters who are out in these wildfire environments. Take California as just a great example, because we see that on the news where they're on fire as we're having this conversation.
yeah, yep.
Fire seasons used to end. That the folks would tell me, September, October, November, we end fire season. Here we are, and they're still having red flag warnings, high risk, and fire on the ground. And the reason I bring that up, in part, is because these firefighters are getting worn out season after season after season, deployment after deployment, minimal time at home, so on and so forth. Don't have to explain that to this audience. They need help.
Yeah.
They need help. And those firefighters that are in regions less prone to wildfire, and you have resources available, maybe your community supported enough that you could deploy out and provide some level of assistance on these fires. And I'm not saying dig in the trenches. That might not be the right space for you based on your training. But surely there's a role in the ecosystem of wildfire deployments where you can provide support and relieve pressure off the wildland firefighters who are out there. Maybe you're going to provide EMS into that community. Maybe you've got a logistics knack,
Yeah.
and you can go out and join a management team and do logistics or resource management, or all these ICS things that you had learned about. They're being deployed every day on these wildfires. You understand it because of the nature of our business. You can help out. And then the third thing I wanted to talk about that's just important that the fire service industry is aware of: the codes and standards, and how they're impacting how your structures are built and developed, which is now we're seeing translate into insurability of properties. And so maybe firefighters are kind of on the tangentially paying attention to that, saying, I don't know. But if you're a property owner and you've dealt with your own property insurance, you're paying a little bit more attention. And if your fire leadership, if your fire chiefs in these communities, and I implore you to pay attention, but I was a firefighter too, so I'm trying to think about where I would have been. But if you're a fire chief on this, your constituency is having problems with property insurance if you're in a wildfire prone region or you have a wildfire problem coming to you. And these insurers, not to get too deep into the weeds on how the insurance industry works, I've learned more about it in the last 2 to 3 years than I ever cared to know about how property insurance works. But essentially this risk is, these insurance pools, these insurance markets are pooled. So your rates may be going up because hurricanes are wiping out properties in Florida, in the South, and wildfires are wiping out properties in California. So if you've got elevated wildfire risk, then you also are seeing this experience with whether or not you've had a wildfire in your recency, your insurance is changing because it's related to fire. You're lucky if your insurance rates are only going up. I can't believe I was saying that too, just a couple of years ago, because it was, we have these outrageous, quote, outrageous increases in wildfire insurance. Of course, my friends out in Florida are saying, hold my beer, when it comes to cost of insurance, like you guys don't know in Oregon, like what we're dealing with. Got it. But now we're wishing we had that problem where the conversation was, boy, this is getting expensive. Because instead we have property owners calling the fire chief on the phone saying, my insurance carrier just dropped me, says I'm an uninsurable property because of fire risk. I need your help. What can we do? And so part of the why it's necessary across our United States is just understanding how that process of risk is determined by insurance industry and fire service. Because we got the shared interest. Neither of us want a building to burn to the ground. So if we start looking at not insurance, but looking at risk collectively as an industry, and then how do we wrap our minds around lowering community level risk to whatever your risks are. Right now, we're talking about wildfire prone regions. Got to be part of that conversation. And that's part of the work that we're doing now, is trying to get message out. And you're helping us with this conversation today, getting in the fire chief's ears and the firefighters' ears and saying, listen, I need you to understand more about how the risk market, how risk markets work. And I need you to understand how risk, and need you to engage. And part of that's codes and standards.
Yeah. Which a lot of times firefighters, we don't care about codes and standards until something happens. Then we're like, wait a minute, how were they able to build this?
Yeah.
I do a Chief Waldo, IEFC Chief Waldo, impression about him talking about them trying to pass some policies with one stairwell, one means of egress, right? But wildfire policy also, right? Hey, we can't continually put these structures. We need some barrier between some of these structures in certain areas, right? And what right now, like with policy, and I know you're still bobbing. What kind of things, when we say policy, what kind of things should we kind of be aware about?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And one example on codes that I'd like to give, Zam, before I answer that I think really is pertinent to firefighters and why we're having this conversation about fire. But one piece that was missed, arguably, by the fire service, or at least in the execution, was in building communication systems. Like I travel all over the country, and I hear firefighters telling us all the communication infrastructure isn't good enough. I walk into the building with my radio, I can't get radio transmissions out. Well, that could have been solved through some code development. We saw that in Las Vegas. We had bidirectional antennas mandated in our buildings in the city of Las Vegas. We didn't have those types of problems. So this is an area where advocacy from the fire service, with a forethought ahead of what that risk might look like, we can solve these issues. That's your policy, advocacy perspective.
Right. And that's why like organizations like FirstNet, and I know certain companies are really battling that. Motorola, it comes to mind too. Like they're really battling that for our safety, right? Like we don't care about it until our radio doesn't work.
Right.
Yeah. But you're on that other side saying, I want to make sure that radio always does. And first of all, I say thank you, because we're not very appreciative of that stuff, because if nothing goes wrong, we never think of it. So I'm going to say that. So first and foremost, you're thinking communication has got to be in the conversation about policy, especially when we're talking about wildfires.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And then what other things are you kind of, and as I said, you're bobbing, but as you go down and you come back up, you're like, wait a minute, this makes sense, right? This makes sense. So communications is one. And then what's another?
We were just talking about codes and standards. Let me bring that back up. So just from even a policy conversation, we have to redefine how we talk about wildfire. And if you've heard Dr. Moore Merrill, our U.S. Fire Administrator, out and about any time in the last 3.5 years during her administration, like she's been abundantly clear about this topic. We have historically just referred to it as a wildland fire problem.
Yes.
And what we are actually experiencing on the ground is a wildfire problem. And kind of using her words, wildland is a geography. A wildfire is sort of this out of control, fire environment, mass loss. Well, that's happening in structure to structure conflagrations today. We saw that in Southern Oregon. I was the fire defense board chief for the Alameda fire, which was one of many, many conflagration fires we had in Oregon on Labor Day weekend of 2020. And I watched this fire take out 2,500 homes across Jackson County, Oregon in the span of, a day, and didn't touch 1 square foot of forest. Was not a wild land fire problem. This was a urban conflagration wildfire that started out in a field that looks like fields all across the United States and got energized by somewhere between 70 to 80 mile per hour winds and just shoved from building to building to building. And then you have this massive fire spread. So the conversation historically, particularly at the federal level, has been around wildland fire.
Right.
So you talk to someone in Congress about a wildfire, they turn to the Forest Service, because the Forest Service is the only firefighting agency that their military fire base installation firefighters that are federal firefighters. I don't want to exclude them, but by and large, the firefighting force known to the federal government's the U.S. Forest Service, the wildland firefighters, and the BLM from the Department of Interior. The voice for structural firefighting community, this U.S. Fire Administration, who's largely not had, a voice when it comes to this, because they just turned to the Forest Service. And so that's something we're working on doing now from kind of that policy perspective, is just changing the conversation to say wildfire is affecting all of us. The reason we're talking about this, at scale in national news is because it's burning communities to the ground. Those communities are being protected by local fire agencies who are engaged in that. We need the community, or what we referred to in this type of business called the built environment. The built environment is equally part of this wildfire problem, needs to have larger voice in this conversation, and we need to look at this wildfire problem differently.
Right. And I've even messed up and said wildland a couple times.
Yeah.
And based on what you're saying, wildland is like, that's maybe just, a forest fire, let's say, for instance, that's wildland. But what's happening is it's not just there. It's all of a sudden it starts to hit the more it'll hit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 homes, because they're so closely together. Like what we saw probably in Maui, or right, what happened in Hawaii,
in Lahaina,
and what happened in Oregon, like you're saying. So really, we should be starting to say, this is a wildfire problem, right? Like,
yes.
Should we get wildland out altogether, or like how would you like people to kind of approach that?
Yeah, I say we communicate about a wildfire problem, and that is all encompassing of this built environment piece that we are talking about, and forest, right? And forest management, because a fire can be a wildland fire or it can be an urban conflagration. Both are wildfires,
right?
So
one leads to the other, right? One leads to the other really easy. So hey, we're talking wildfire. And
because just to interrupt you, sorry for a second, because if we just frame it as a wildland fire problem, then the money and effort, the resources, time, money, and effort to solve that problem goes to the forest purely.
Yep.
All right, give the forest more money, and they need money too. And I don't want this to sound like it's us against them. It's the problem's bigger than that. So we have to if we change the way that we define that, the way that we frame this, we understand and say we have a wildfire problem. It is both in the forest. We need money to help that. And it's in the built environment. We need money to help that. And, here we go. So elevating the framing of this conversation is a paramount piece to us moving the policy agenda forward.
And that's perfectly said. Right. Like that's a truck guy like me. I'm like, oh, I get it. right. But I'm hoping a lot of our listeners are going, okay. I thought that was a typo why they're saying wildfire.
Yeah.
Right. So, and I'm glad we hit that home. There is wildland. Yeah. The problem here is a bigger scale wildfire in general, because that does include codes. That includes forest, but it includes codes and all these other things that even structural guys need to take note of. And, and we originally we talked about code and how communications needs to be integrated. Anything in particular that you're kind of thinking and looking at?
Yeah, one example is if you are going to build in a high risk area or a wildfire prone region, then we need to build to the international WUI, Wildland Urban Interface WUI code, and that's not happening across our communities. Code development is largely a county related issue.
Hmm.
So it isn't necessarily something that the federal, government wants to take on. And I'm not suggesting that they do. But down at this local level, to say, if you're going to build at this risk, you need to build to this international. Well, you can build a structure. You can build a home that's hardened. That's home hardening is what we call it in this space. Hardened home, defensible space. Those are the two best things from a characteristics of your structure and your property that's going to reduce your risk.
Hmm.
When we do that property to property to property, it's community level or neighborhood level risk mitigation. We can protect communities, but we have to start there. And the idea of, well, we just sort of educate people who are building, they're going to do the right thing. They're not. Like, the education piece moves the needle ever so slightly, and let's do it. Let's get those ones on board that the education piece is going to work for them. But other than that, listen, if you're going to build here, you have to build this way. It's putting your neighbors, making it safer for your neighbors, safer for your community, and by and large safer for your firefighters when they're having to approach this event. So hardy plank siding, non-combustible roof, keep the trees off your roof, type of thing. And you can have beautiful aesthetics, because that's one of the misnomers in these conversations is, firefighters just want me to clear cut my property, no trees anywhere. Like, none of that is in fact the case. That you can have an aesthetically pleasing home that's built to code.
Yeah.
To be fair, though, because as a policy guy, I like to give both sides. Because it's, as an advocate would present their one side of the case and say, you're a fool if you don't do this. And an analyst, provides both sides of that. And the trade-off is cost. And we argue about it. Now, the cost, some of us would say, and I would even say, it's marginal. It's a marginal cost when you're building your house to do it to this hardy plank siding. And it was, a couple $1,000s on I can't remember the anchoring point, but it was somewhere, I think, about a $250,000 house. This is on a Headwater economics study, and I'm misquoting it. But the point I want to make is, that is real. That is real money. And I don't want to downplay that. A couple $1,000s on the build of a house isn't real money, and could be prohibitive for some people. Can be.
Yeah.
But that's a value judgment there that a decision maker ultimately has to make, is say, do we want to reduce risk across the community? If you're going to build, you're going to have to build to that standard, safer for the fire environment, so on and so forth, less cost to the community in the grand scheme of reducing risk. So there's a lot of arguments that are in favor of it. The advocacy on the other side is affordable housing is typically a problem all across the United States. Developers will suggest that, and that's kind of their bread and butter argument on everything that's a code enhancement. Add another regulation, add another code. It's going to cost more money. Got to pass that to the consumer. Can't afford to build, so on and so forth. So here we are, right, in that tension, in the policy conversation around this. And the one lever that I think is advancing this interest from my lens is the availability of insurance. Because if the insurance carriers are saying, we're not writing your property unless you do XYZ, and some of that XYZ is being defined by the insurance industry's research arm, the Institute for Business and Home Safety, who's doing remarkable work. They have a tremendous amount of experts, scientifically validated recommendations for homes to be built to a standard. And they're moving right now as we speak into trying to get to certified community level for validated risk reduction, which is really exciting.
Yeah.
This is where you do the work, you build the home, at a structurally sound way. Your mitigations matter. That's recognized by the insurance companies and their underwriting in your premiums. And now that couple $1,000 investment you put into your property is saving you in the availability in your insurance. Like, it's a wash. So there you are. Like, that's in a nutshell some of the conversation, particularly in the policy arguments around whether or not there should or shouldn't be codes.
Safety, that's the other thing, right? Like, people don't push for this to be a code until something happens, unfortunately, right? Like, this is a situation where family was in that home and they didn't have the siding, right? Like, I mean, that's the other part that we have to really open our eyes to. Like, as firefighters, we don't realize how much code saves our lives in a fire situation,
No
right?
question.
Like, and in this case too, one home could turn into 10 to 15. Now, all of a sudden we're in the middle of that because they weren't following, like you were saying, some of the codes that people really worked hard to get. And I think, right, like, that's, like you said, that's that balance that we have to find. But as a structural firefighter, or as any firefighter in the fire service, we have to start taking note of these things, because a lithium ion car drives into a field, starts that field on fire, hits um, a new development where they're not following that. We now have a wildfire problem
That's
in
right.
our territory, right? Where
Yeah.
we said before, there's no way. Look at it's all homes. But your
Yep.
point is, that's that is a that is a breeding ground for a wildfire if not
Yes.
following these other particular codes and preventative measures. So understanding, like, so far you're educating a truck guy like me very well. So I appreciate
All
you kind of
right.
dumbing things down. You're doing great with it. Right. So all of a sudden I'm now interested. Okay. I know the difference between wildland, wildfire. Wildfire is going to be a problem, because I look at now some of my the subdivisions that are in my city, like, holy cow. Yeah. They're right on top of each other. And,
Mhm.
right. Like, they could easily be 1, 2, 3. We've had 30, 40 mile per hour winds, fairly common. I'm looking right now. It's doing that. But so on top of that, you're looking at, communications. We looked at policy. We're looking at code. Education, you had mentioned. Dig a little bit more into that. Like, where are your efforts going towards that then?
So, a couple of things. I mean, we know a lot about human behavior, maybe that we didn't even know 20 or 30 years ago. And I'm critical of the one size fits all. We, print out a brochure and we go
Mhm.
hand it to someone at the grocery store that says defensible space is in your best interest to go do it. And someone looks at it kind of surprised, like, oh, I didn't know that, this, that, or the other thing. And they go engage. And that, you get those, like those people exist. That does happen, but at scale just isn't working. Like I got, I got the borderline high cholesterol,
Yeah.
situation. I have no problem putting that out there. So I'll hold myself accountable. It's not an education issue. Like it isn't because I don't know that my eating, habits are not conducive to me having a low cholesterol. I know
Right.
what the problem is. It's the implementation and execution of changing my behavior that is the problem. So the more that we can dive into these notions of behavior change and execute interventions that move the needle that way, and this is where economic incentives come in to be particularly beneficial. And we've tried this in our health and wellness programs to mixed success sometimes. Hey, listen, your BMI is maybe not where it should be ideally, and if we do this, then maybe there's some incentive downstream. There's some communities that have financial incentives for you. Maybe it's time off. It's some areas it's cheaper insurance.
Yep.
Insurance, cheaper premiums for your health insurance if you meet certain, so I'm just sort of making this correlation between behavior change and the education bit. And so we're getting better on how to approach some of these issues around wildfire risk reduction, that's focusing more in depthly on behavior. And one of those, frankly, is compulsion, which is what codes do. Like we compel you to do this, to do whatever it is that we need you to do, because the incentives weren't working or the education wasn't working, and it's not enough at scale.
Yeah.
Those are different approaches. Like different
Right.
communities try different approaches. Some go to regulatory mode. Some say like no regulatory, but we want to try this first. All good, and we have means to support all of that.
Yeah. You need to try it, like takes different angles, right? And it takes different situations.
Yeah.
Right. Sometimes we're more apt to listen to things after a particular situation, unfortunately. Right. Like,
Yes.
but we're seeing that, like, even now you had mentioned West Coast, as we're recording this, West Coast is under, they've been fighting the wildfires there for, gosh, I mean, like, the season has basically been prolonged, but also East Coast has now been reaching
Yeah.
out to you and saying, we now have this issue. And, as you moved from the West Coast back to the East Coast, you're taking these phone calls a lot more often, right? Like,
Yeah.
and what are those conversations kind of starting like, and what do they sound like?
Yeah. And I'll correct one thing. I didn't move back to the East Coast. This is my first time ever being
Oh,
in
I'm
the
sorry.
East
Yes,
Coast.
you moved from West Coast To the
West
East
to
Coast. My
yeah,
bad.
west to
Yes.
further west all across to the East Coast, and I'll
Yes.
tell you what, there's a learning curve for me too, because the fires in the East, the wildfires, or the bush fires and the brush fires, as we term them out in the East, are different. Right? It's different terrain, different topography, different experience that they're having. So I'm learning a lot about the different fire environment that our East Coast colleagues are facing on a regular basis. The exciting part, if I can, about these phone calls is our commanders are recognizing they're seeing something different than they've ever seen in the past. They know it's unfamiliar to them, and they're looking for guidance, and they're looking for guidance from us, from the U.S. Fire Administration, and in many cases they're looking for us to make connections to their peers in an environment who do have that kind of experience, and so can help the commanders make better tactical decisions. And then even more inspiring is after they get out of the immediate threat, it's okay, we've got to really engage in this year round with mitigation and prevention efforts and communication to our community. Can you guide us into that, best practices? And that's what we're positioned to do. We're positioned to help support local fire agencies with that kind of information, with access to that kind of training, so that they're better prepared across the community, across the fire service.
The Fire Store, equipping protectors with passion. Every decision we make as a company is about you, our customer. We wouldn't be where we are today without you, and we don't take that lightly. We understand that having the right gear can mean the difference between life and death. Our goal is to get you the gear you need, when you need it, at prices you can afford. Visit us at thefirestore.com for everything but the truck, and shop our family of brands, including Streamlight, MSA, Lion, Fleer, and more. Now let's get back to the show.
What are those conversations mainly about evacuation plans, or is it all encompassing? Is it codes, evacuation plans?
Evacuation plans is in fact the priority number one that I had made a recommendation when I was on this phone call. They said, help us out. What do we do? So if your community is at threat or at risk, the number one thing we need to be communicating about is evacuations. We need to be prepared on how we evacuate. How we evacuate in different disasters, it changes. And pretty sure that a storm coming out of the ocean is going to come out of the ocean every time, whether it hits in North Carolina or South Carolina or Louisiana. Maybe the predictive analytics sort of to give you a wide berth and we see where it lands, or Florida, Georgia when it lands, but it's coming from the ocean. A wildfire, you don't always know where it's going to start, and so a lot of communities want to have fixed evacuation strategies like you might in a tsunami. This is the tsunami route. When you have a tsunami alarm, you go this route. And the danger, as you can imagine, around wildfire is you don't know where it's going to start and you don't know where it's going to spread. And many times you have, not just a wildfire, you have multiple wildfires because of the ember spread. And that's something that was new to me, because I told you I'd learned wildfire from the outside view. And so I had my own bias on what I thought it was. I thought this big wave of fire came and took out a community. And while this big wave of fire is taking out a community, it's also launching fireballs like a Roman candle, embers right off the top of it being pushed by that wind we talked about, and starting a new fire and a new fire and a new fire. And all of that ends up converging into a major, a bigger wildfire. So you run a risk. And I heard a California commander explain to me once about, we were having this conversation around evacuations and evacuation strategies and why it needed such coordination across the fire community, because one incident commander shows up on a fire, sees the fire, can anticipate fire spread, and orders an evacuation to say, let's go east. And meanwhile, another fire was emerging, and you've got that commander saying, listen, you got to go, we go west. And before you know it, we've just evacuated two communities into each other. And that was a real example he was sharing on a conversation around how can technology help improve that environment. This was just a number of years ago, but I think it's a good illustration about, okay, getting people to safety is first and foremost. We have to do that. In the structural environment, we approach fires the same way. Like, we need working smoke alarms. We need you to be notified and be able to get out fast. period. Like, we need people out of harm's way. We'll attack the fire, but first and foremost, we need to do that and approach wildfire the same way. If you're experiencing this community, that's what you need to do. Second is, how are your firefighters? Are they prepared for this? From a tactical perspective, from a training perspective, and those are longer term fixes. You can't fix that today.
Yeah. If it's in your backyard, you got to just deal with it
phone
today.
call.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have what you have, and this is how we're going to recommend you approach that. But in terms of community preparation, having them ready to evacuate, having your this is coordination with the sheriff and local law enforcement, emergency management. Evacuations have a bit more complicated nature to it than other fire-related decisions that get made, because you have other partners who are part of that. And that's we probably do a whole podcast on what does that look like after you evacuate a community, and having to shelter folks in place and provide protection for their properties, and reasonable reasons why people won't evacuate.
Yep.
So, I think that's a good starting point in terms of preparation, evacuating your community, providing safety for those folks, making sure firefighters know how to get in and out, and providing for a safe environment for them to work. And what does that look like going forward? Like, those are the recommendations we're starting with.
And then, are you also IC, right? Incident command. We had talked off camera a little bit about that. Like, that's another point of emphasis is trying to stay within that incident command structure too, right?
From the fire community, I see a lot. I see the incident command structure system used, embraced. It's where we start to see challenges is when you maybe bring in other public safety entities who haven't trained or practiced or rehearsed collaboratively on them. And we put a lot of energy in Las Vegas and Southern Nevada working with law enforcement to understand their model against the incident command, the ICS structure that we use in the fire service. And we studied this. We're all credentialed to the basic ICS. Maybe you get the 300, 400 if you're at the captain BC level and this kind of thing. And you studied it, and you maybe did some exercises, but it's not something other than routine or maybe a slightly escalating fire into a multiple alarm type of thing. And thought I had an understanding of it until I move into the wildfire prone region in Oregon, and you see the full Monty. You got the finance and the admin and the logistics and the whole bit, and you see how when set up well, how it can grow and how it can shrink as necessary. And so we're, I no reason to think that hasn't been successful or been implemented in some of these programs. It's not as well exercised in areas that don't have larger either disasters or planned events, special events, like our friends, out in New York they're planning events on the daily, dozens of them on the daily, using that type of structure. So it can be incredibly effective. The other element who's a player in these conversations are like state forestry, who use ICS, doesn't always integrate well. So that's an important piece on relationships you may have across your community. Does your forest community integrate well with a unified command structure about, who's in charge when this fire started in a house and spread to the wildland,
Right.
or it started in the wildland and spread to a house, and like these kinds of things, as you could imagine, do erupt into some challenges along the way. So having plans and preparations and building relationships for those kinds of things are paramount for leaders who find themselves in this space.
Yeah. That's a great drill that you just created for our listeners, right? Lithium ion battery fire in a field, like sets a house on fire, right? Sets the field on fire, sets a house on fire, another house on fire. Now you have a wildfire burning in a suburb of a major metropolitan area, which can happen when you look at the building construction and you look at high winds now are going on, right? Let's, God forbid it doesn't happen, but let's talk about it. What are we doing? Right? We're going to have to evacuate city blocks. We're going to have to create a command structure now that gets multiple agencies involved quickly. Do we have a communication strategy to the people involved? Right? Like, oh my God, this is all of a sudden here. Set that scenario up. How is your department, how are you ready for this? Because as you had said right away in minute one, this wildfire is everyone's problem. We have to pay attention to it, because if it's not in your backyard now, it will be. And just look at the cases all around the country and the world, right?
Yes.
And you had mentioned earlier about technology, though. How can technology not only help us with education, but with trying to stay ahead of these fires and maybe even try to identify some of the spots where they're more prone?
It's a great question, and there's a tremendous amount of investment going into the technology opportunities, technology solutions. And one of those that's really valuable is predictive analytics. We've relied heavily in our industry, for good, bad, or indifferent. This is what we had. We had, expert intuition by a very seasoned veteran
Yeah.
officer who's
Yep.
seen this fire in this
They
area
look
for
up in
so
the air,
long.
they check the wind, and they go, "Zam's out, 3 blocks
Yeah.
to the west," right? Yeah.
Yes. And I want to sort of celebrate that that officer had done a successful job throughout their career. Well, two things. One, it's probably not the best way for us to make informed, evidence-driven decisions. And number two, tho- those folks with that experience are retiring out, and that institutional knowledge is not easy to transfer. So I don't know how it is in your organization, but the ones that I was a part of, we've high turnover of our experienced cadre. We've got a very young, in terms of experience, workforce age and experience, but predominantly experience for this conversation, which also translates into young officers. So it's not uncommon that you've got a brand new officer on with a brand new driver engineer with a brand new crew and maybe even a brand new battalion chief who may have 20 years in the organization, but brand new at the battalion chief. And all of that starts to set up, recipes for concern. For where we're going with technology, like, it's a different conversation as well. I need to be aware that that environment exists and not put that kind of pressure on our officers that you can perform like somebody who's been a 20-year captain who's sort of seen it all and done it all, because they can't. So
Mhm.
let's not pretend like they can, and let's make sure they have the tools they need to be successful given the experience that they bring to that conversation. And that's where we're trying to go with predictive analytics. The other piece to that conversation is, even these seasoned veteran wildland firefighters and wildfire commanders are sharing. I hear this in my travels as I'm learning again, wildfire from the outside view, is these fires are behaving like I've never seen before. That's a red, like, fire chiefs hear that, that's a red flag. Anybody hears that's a red flag. This isn't like the ones I've seen before. And that tells me we have a changing environment. That tells me we don't know as much as we need to know to be able to make, better decisions. And so what tools are available to us that we may or may not have access to, or what tools do we have access to that we're not using? And what tools do we really need that we may not have? And that's this part of where we're trying to drive technology. And there's great investment on that, to say, if we have confidence and we can use maybe some machine learning modeling, and this is all being tested right now, that can build a decision support system around where that fire is likely to be going, and the likelihood that it's going to cause some kind of harm, we can manage it, more effectively. So this is satellite imagery, drone, sensor technologies, sensors pre-positioned, out and about the community to understand the fire and its spread, improved modeling on structure to structure spread, so we can understand the risk and put that into these analytics and spit out information that may be valuable to an incident commander. That's important. Not all wildfires, all wildland fires, since we created this distinguishment between the two, not all wild land fires should need to be extinguished. Like that's an important part of this kind of, like, that isn't
Yeah.
what we don't go to the academy to say, here's how you let a fire burn. Uh, Not structural firefighters don't. Like, we go in, we put fires out, and we move on about our day. Um, some fires need to burn. Like, fire is a natural part of our ecosystem, and because we have not allowed fires to burn the way that nature has needed them to, it's part of why we're in this problem. We
Yeah.
have very, very dense forests, which is creating, worse issues. So how do we get better at managing fires and managing the intensity of a fire so that we're at a level that does not threaten the community? Sure, it's going to put a little smoke out in the community. We got to get comfortable with a little bit of smoke, because it's just part of us getting out of this problem.
Yep.
And
It's a
that's a
much
hard one.
natural it's a natural smoke too. Like,
Yes,
it's not these chemicals burning, it's like
yeah.
nature that's burning.
And
Yep.
society is mixed, in terms of our willingness to accept a little bit of smoke, versus big catastrophic wildfire smoke.
Yeah.
So that's a policy conversation
Uh, uh,
that's certainly
you know,
ongoing.
if you were in, all the Canadian wildfires, right? All
Yeah,
that smoke came right down like through Wisconsin, New York.
yeah,
If you can use prevention to,
yep,
right, like all this, smoke is your issue. well, you just lost that entire argument, because look at all the smoke that this has created because we weren't proactive. Right?
Yes. Yeah.
And I know West Coast is really struggling with that because they want some proactive fires because they're just so far behind the 8 ball, right? And I think that's kind of
Yes.
what you're emphasizing here. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And get, when fires start, maybe lightning start or they just start, human caused, and that's a fire in an area that the ecosystem and the land management folks have determined is an area that needs to burn. How do we manage the fire in a way that allows for that system? And is there a regulatory or policy space that allows for that to happen? And how can technology inform decisions like that that may be better off for our ecosystems at large? So that is in motion. We were talking a little bit about autonomous helicopters, and some military Black Hawk helicopters that have been decommissioned from the military are being converted into autonomous, wildfire firefighting helicopters, and that's being developed and tested as we speak to be able to get more aircraft into the system to be able to manage fires effectively. So pretty insane. I don't know. I mean, there's probably some sensitivity around, drone type helicopters right now. We're having this recording, and if you turn on the news, there's like mystery drones flying everywhere.
Yeah.
Maybe we're not as excited to hear about this as I am, as a wildfire person. But it's a big deal, and a lot of real. I want to credit some of the great work being done by our philanthropic communities, particularly folks like the Moore Foundation, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation out of the West. These are the founders of Intel, and them, through collaboration with other philanthropic interests, have come to the table to say we want to solve big societal issues. I mean, we're talking to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars that are being invested to help reduce risk to wildfire. And so some of the advancements we're seeing in research and science and technology, satellite deployment, sensors, so on and so forth, is made largely because they stepped up to the plate and said, we're going to make a difference in this area. So I think it's important to know that just not in this domain, but in others, that we just have a lot of good-hearted people trying to help solve this issue. And that's really important for us as a nation.
Yeah, and I think knowledge is power. Data is power in this space.
Right.
And that's kind of what you're saying is, and if we can use technology, we can use predictability, we can use education, and it is everybody's problem. And it's I need to take note as a structural firefighter, as an officer. It's coming here. It's going to be in my backyard, right? What else? I mean, we've touched on so many parts and topics. First of all, thank you for keeping this on a level I can always understand, right? Like there's a truck guy. But what one or two more things that you want, like someone like myself, to know and transfer on to other people?
I think, one, I'd be remiss if we didn't say, diving into understanding risk across your community and doing everything within your abilities to mitigate that risk ahead of an event. And while that sounds, silly and intuitive, we don't always do it. We still have a culture where we wait for bells to go off and then we go out and, the shoot. Back when I was a firefighter, we knew the areas that would flood. Vegas had terrible water drain off system. So anytime it had monsoon rain, it would flood and it would hit into these flood channels where the homeless population was living. And we're out there putting our lives at risk on rescues. And it wasn't until later, till I'm getting involved in technology and sitting with a fire chief across in a meeting saying, I'm just tired of putting, having our folks at risk for this. Like if we just knew it was going to rain and walked out and moved those people out ahead of the flood.
Yeah.
We solved the problem, right? And as silly as that example is, like we really just didn't think like that. We could have done that the whole time. Like we could have.
It makes a hell of a lot of sense, doesn't it?
It's gonna rain. I'm gonna go load in the engine. We're gonna go, or maybe code partners or whomever, like in your community, goes out and says, "Hey, it's raining. Get out of there," that kind of thing. And now you've reduced the risk that you have to put firefighters to. And if we start to just change our framing and how we think about our job as we just respond to things when they happen, I think that's for one a start. Number two, and we have work to do, meaning U.S. Fire Administration and our collaborators, on trying to help you and the providers in the field with your credentialing to help in the wildfire. domain. So right now, it isn't necessarily the easiest transition if you're a company officer and you have your requisite skill set for that to transfer into the NWCG wildland, fire environment. Training that you don't just like company officer doesn't just equal engine boss necessarily. That bridge isn't smooth, and we want it to be smooth, because that friction is creating a barrier for those organizations that want to make a contribution to say, hey, we can help in this environment. And then it becomes too hard for you to get credentialed into that space. Like, that's an issue. So we're working on that. I say that to say, pay attention to those opportunities as we have going forward, as you learn more. If this is all new to you and you're one that, like, you go to conferences and you're able to check into some of these classes, maybe check one or two out in an environment that you're not as familiar with or not comfortable with. So go to a wildfire, command or a tactics level class, or go into a policy class and start to glean and pay attention to it through these lenses, and you'll be well ahead of the game.
I like what you said. Like, be proactive in it and just start to ask some questions, start to learn. There are a lot of resources out there, and you working with the fire administration are really focusing on getting them, not only more user friendly, but obviously available for all of us.
We have a power, Zam, that most other government entities don't have, and that's trust. We have, generally speaking, broad trust across the community, and they're looking to us for leadership in how to protect them from these kinds of disasters. So I think we have a responsibility that comes with that trust to do that. And even in areas that aren't necessarily our particular domain, but if we can go out and leverage the trust we have with our community to delivering a message that's important for law enforcement or emergency management or environmental quality or what have you, public health, I think we can go a long way as a fire service about reducing risk and increasing public safety.
Yeah. Well, very good stuff. I thank you for those insights. And I'm sure our listeners are taking some notes and hopefully doing the same thing I'm doing. And, the biggest thing is, for all you structural guys out there, don't turn a blind eye to this, because before you know it, it's going to be in your lap. And make sure you're asking questions and trying to educate yourself. All right. You owe that to, you're a misfit. If you're listening to this, you're already a misfit. So you owe that to the other misfits, but you also owe it to your community. And now our friend Chief Horton, who is working feverishly behind the scenes, or I should say, bobbing and working as you continually develop. Right?
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Well, again, thanks for that, but you're not done yet. We have some questions more about you personally.
Oh, sure.
So, the first one: if you had to start your career over from day one, what would you do differently?
Oh, well, let's see. It's hard, because this path, that question you get asked where it's, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Like, I've never gotten that right. I was all of a sudden, I'm a fire chief in a community I'd never thought about. Now I'm in Washington, D.C., working on these policy issues, and I've had a blessed career. So it's hard to pull a thread out of that to say what would I have done differently, because it landed me where I'm at today, and that's a scapegoat for your question. But I'll say this: I love being a paramedic. I love that job I had, and that's where I first became passionate about public policy. Frankly, was just seeing the conditions that were out in the streets that I was responding to. I was inner city paramedic in Vegas, first due to our state and county mental health institution, and I was like, this isn't right. Like, this system is broken, and we have to do better. And that's what got me into public policy in the first place. I love being a paramedic, and I love being a fire chief. I love shaping the environment for the workforce to make it a better place to live and work. I love putting programs out into the community to help reduce their risk, and working with collaborators to get things done. I loved those jobs. The supervisory ones in between, maybe not as much. Like some of that I wasn't as crazy about. And if any of my friends who remember those eras can certainly appreciate why. So I would say two things that were unfinished business that I wish I could have done in my career is I wish I would have been a station officer, inner city station officer, where, it was with a smaller crew. I was a downtown officer. There were 3 captains in there. We never agreed on anything. We had 22 firefighters working in that environment. It just wasn't, it was a great assessment center, skills exercise every day and personnel problems. We had plenty of that. So that's one thing I wish I would have had a chance to do. And the other one was to be part of a training cadre and to be able to do Recruit Academy. Because I loved training. I loved teaching. I loved being a preceptor for paramedics. And I never got a chance to be, part of an academy and developing, recruit school worth of folks. So I would say if I do anything different, it would have been taking advantage of an opportunity to do that.
Yeah. You could create your own Wildfire Academy for
I
morons
could.
like me. I
I
think
could.
there you go. Your calling is still there yet, Chief. Hang in
All
there.
right. All right.
It may
And to
not
add,
be the Recruit Academy you wanted, but it's still going to be useful.
I am probably not the best person to be out on the drill field anymore, if we're being honest with each other. And to add to my story, I do love the position that I'm in now, albeit I've only been here for 8 weeks. But to represent the fire service at this level and to have this conversation with other players to keep them informed, like it's a blessing to be able to do this. And I appreciate the support not only Dr. Moore Merrill has given me as our fire administrator and our staff, but the fire service, embracing me as someone who can lead in this space. So I appreciate that too.
Yeah. Well, I have trust in you. You may not be the one teaching it, but you might be the one developing it. We'll go that far with
fair.
And speaking of that, so if you weren't in the fire service, you weren't a firefighter, what would you be doing?
What would I have done? I had an amazing opportunity to go to the Air Force Academy. I did not. I chose not to do that. And some days I look back and my career worked out. I can't complain about where I'm at. I've had an amazing.
You're doing
career.
okay. Yeah.
But I think I would have gone into the military.
Just the structure and right, like
the mission, the structure, patriotism, camaraderie, and the opportunities to learn. As you pointed out earlier, like I love to learn. There's so much about this world that I don't know, and that I like to spend time in books and structured learning environments and try to make myself better thinker, better decision maker. And the military offers a lot of room and space for that. And I felt like a very stable way to earn an income and build a skill set, navigate through. So those were the things I had given thought to. I had a friend whose dad was a colonel in the Air Force, and he was the one who wrapped his arm around me and says, I think let's talk. Right?
Yeah, right. Gave you the old hey, nudge on the arm. I got something for you to try. Kind of
And the TV show Jag was real popular when I was young. I watched that with my parents, on a regular basis. And so I thought being a JAG attorney seemed like a really cool job. Like I wanted to go into law. So I said military, but like more specifically was like military law. And I was like, those guys are pretty cool. And so I was gonna navigate that way. And then I went through a stint where I thought being in the FBI was the coolest thing ever. And then I landed into the fire service. As an undergrad, I was 20 years old when I got hired in the fire service. It was a blessing. And the other part of the career we've already talked about.
Yeah. Wow. I can see that. I can see military. You can't handle the truth, right? Like that could have been you. Who knows, right?
Yeah.
But you mentioned like you are into the books a lot. You are, you've joined a lot of different organizations that have helped you grow. And obviously that's a big part of your culture. It's a big part of this culture of this podcast, right? That's what we're all about. And so I bring it back home to, one of the best questions that I love asking guests, and it's what are you doing to get better?
I think it's recognizing where the limitations of our knowledge are. I mean, asking a lot of that of myself. When I teach students, I ask this question a lot, whether it's fire students or I teach an undergraduate program at Oregon State in wildland fire science. I didn't have a say in the name. We're trying to change the name, but it's Wildland over there. And it's, really challenging people in the way that they're thinking about these issues. And the most popular question, I ask in feedback is, how do you know this to be true? Because we spew all kinds of, we pontificate all day long around a kitchen table in a fire station about what we think are facts. And you're like, how do you know that to be true? And from that knowledge set, like, what are the limitations of that knowledge? So I ask myself that question a lot. I try to challenge my preconceived notions and my assumptions. I try to find disconfirming information and say, is this a reasonable assumption or not? So like that's wrapping around critical thinking by asking, how do we know this to be true?
Mhm.
Is this true, or is this just an assumption we're making?
And I have to emphasize this too, that one of the great things I took from our conversation before the show is when you're talking to policymakers, your theory on it. And can you just reiterate that? Because I think that holds true for so many different decisions that we need, and ways that chiefs and people need to hold themselves. I mean, what is your approach when you're
Yeah.
dealing with those policymakers?
I stand out as an anomaly in a conversation around politics. I find, because like a lot of people, I hate politics. I hate politics. It's the same person that's trying to nudge into the chief on why they should be promoted to the next officer or what have you. That same person hates politics, yet they're
Yep.
navigating a political environment themselves. I've always loved the political system. I love our government, our governance system here. So I have a tremendous amount of understanding to people who value things differently than I might see it. Like I am an individual. I have my own value and belief systems. We all do. That doesn't necessarily guide my work. It does guide some of the passion around my work for sure, but it doesn't always guide my work. What we try to do is understand the facts. I mentioned earlier in our conversation, like I try to understand both sides, and that's how I learned policy. I learned policy and political work around understanding all sides of an issue. You should be able to make a compelling case for your opposition argument as well as you can make one for your own. And if you can't, then you probably don't understand the issue well enough, because most of what we're talking about in politics lands on a value judgment. If you have a conservative ideology, it maybe low taxed, individual freedom kind of people for themselves kind of decision making. That might be like where you lean. So that's what your preference would be when given a policy option.
Mhm.
If you're in a left leaning ideology, it may be, listen, for the collective good, we need to all pay more in taxes and have more social safety net and more social programs, and this is what's good, best for a society, and this is where we should be. And we get mad about that, like, and I don't, if that's how you believe, that's how you believe. And it's my job isn't necessarily to persuade you at your deep level value and belief system to think differently. If you're a decision Now we're talking about, like, if you're a decision maker,
Right. Right.
my job is to inform you with the evidence that we have, and I'll frame both sides to it. In fact, when I talk to folks who are new into, like, state legislators, I got a chance to visit with several of those. I always coached them to say, ask who the opposition is. Because everybody will frame it, even when you're a chief officer, your captain, the same thing. As people are bringing you ideas and they're saying we should do X, right? And they present it in a way that you feel like you're an idiot if you don't do X. Like,
Yeah.
everybody wants X, like we should do this. Like, why aren't we doing? They present it, and the most important question, I'd ask that to firefighters. Okay, who's opposed to this? Who doesn't want this to be the thing? Right? And if they say, "Oh no, everybody loves it," well, then they didn't do their homework, right? And they're trying to pull wool over your eyes.
Right.
Someone is
Someone doesn't like it. Yeah.
so is it A shift over here? Is it
Yeah.
the
It's
downtown?
usually C shift, chief. You
C
know that.
shifts, yeah, it's silly. Like, we all need to have whatever is the latest and greatest in fitness, this, that, or the other. We need this in all the stations, chief. Everybody wants it, and then this crew comes in, so they want something different. Like,
Yep.
I'm using that as a silly example, but listen, be honest. Like, it's no different down at the Capitol. It's no different down at your state capitals. This is what's going on, bargaining, negotiating. So from a policy perspective, it's coming in, it's making your case, it's explaining the opposition side. Here's who's opposed to this. Developers are opposed to codes. Fire industries in favor of codes. Here's the trade-offs, constraints, trade-offs, and competing interests, Sam. That's what it comes down to.
Yeah.
So all of these decisions are they're never cut and dry. They're always framed around constraints, trade-offs, and competing interests. Sometimes it's labor agreements are constraints. It's usually the budget is a constraint. You usually have opposite constituency groups that have different coalitions that form around a different issue. So all of that exists on all of this. Policy decisions that are being made at the organizational level, at the department level, at the chief level, all the way through our elected leaders. And so my job is to get them informed about the consequences of the decision, however they make it. So when they choose to make a decision, even if it's not the one I want them to make, they make it informed, and they understand the consequences of that, and then they can decide if they sleep at night with the outcome that comes from something like that. That's how I approach policy. That's how I approach leadership.
Well, and I think that's a great way to summarize kind of everything that we've talked about, right? Like we're here to give you knowledge, right?
Mm.
And we're going to educate you the best that we can, and then encourage you to find out, right? Like you had said, one of the ways that you're getting better is to try to just get the facts and seek knowledge, right? You're always trying to like you said, better yourself, but be active in that process. I think that's a process of growth, right? And I thank you for your time and for your efforts on trying to make that positive change within, the fire service, and especially now with your role. I don't want to put too much pressure on you, but I'm looking for good things coming from your office, and you've already given me a lot of knowledge that I'm going to go out now. Hopefully, not only transfer that to our listeners, but to my crew, and do a little bit more research just on the wildfire problem. Great stuff. Thank you, Chief, for all the insights. And for those that are just listening to this, I highly encourage you. You should go to our YouTube channel. If you have questions for myself or for Chief, you can email us, bettereveryshift@firerescue1.com. We hope that you'd rate, review the show, and share this with your crew, with your department, with other people that are within the realm of the fire service, or anybody that you think that needs to listen to this message. And just to reiterate all the different great things that Chief Horton shared with us today. Understand wildfire. Understand it is your problem, and it will be if it's not right in your backyard. But as we're seeing case by case by case, it's continually developing. And then try to seek the facts, seek knowledge, and seek the truth to make yourself better, because it's all about learning something, doing something, and sharing something to make you and those around you better every shift. Thanks for listening, everybody.